Chapter 7. Carl Boyles. Carl Boyles' criminal record took up 2 thick files in the Hot House record room. The paper trail gave a step-by-step account of Boyles' development into a cold, calculating killer. Born in Lubbock, Texas in 1940, Boyles was only 8 years old when he first got into trouble. At the time, a social worker theorized that he was acting out because his parents' marriage was disintegrating and he wanted attention. His father, according to prison files, was a drunk, a womanizer, and frequently out of work. Boyles' mother was beaten by her husband. They fought constantly, and Boyles had basically raised himself. He had done a poor job. I was on my own, hanging around the streets. At age 11, he was declared a habitual truant. At 12, he was declared incorrigible by the juvenile courts. And at 15, Boyles was sent by a Texas judge to the Gatesville State Training School for Boys. A court psychologist who examined him wrote this when he entered the reformatory. The source of this boy's trouble is his deep feelings of rejection by his parents. He is very anxious for love and stability. He seems to have developed a hostile identification with his mother, yet is very dependent on her. There is some sexual disturbance in this boy. Homosexuality is quite possible. It is likely it would be covert. If Boyles was looking for love and acceptance, he certainly didn't find it at Gatesville. Like most Texas reformatories at the time, the program was designed to break a boy's bad habits with brutal punishment and slave labor. Every boy, regardless of his age, worked 10 hours in the fields, usually picking cotton. Troublemakers were put in the bullpen, a tiny isolation box. Boyles would later recall that he arrived at Gatesville on an early Sunday, the only day when boys didn't work, and was told to report to a counselor in the school's recreation room. When he opened the screen door and looked inside, all 50 or so of the boys stopped what they were doing. An older boy twice his age and twice his size came up to him. "Hey, what size shoes do you wear?" the boy asked. "Don't know," said Boyles. "Let me see one of them, will you?" the boy asked politely. Boyles sat on the floor and removed a shoe. The older boy took off one of his own shoes and put on Boyles. "How about let me see the other one?" Still holding the jagged end, Boyles lunged forward at another boy. But before he could stab his target, Boyles was knocked to the floor by a fist. He looked up just in time to see another fist smash into his face. It was the adult counselor. For the next 7 days, Boyles worked his regular 10-hour shift, cutting cotton, and then 4 more hours as punishment. He worked barefoot, just as he had been when the counselor found him, and he didn't say a word to anyone. At night, he was locked in the sweltering bullpen, which wasn't big enough for him to lie down in. When his punishment ended, Boyles was assigned a housing unit. As I am walking up the steps, the guy who took my shoes steps out the door and puts my shoes down and says, "Here are your shoes, man. Thanks for not snitching, I sat down and put my shoes on and went in. Only this time, it was Carl Boyles who was taking advantage of the new kid. It was my turn to dish it out, he recalled. I had earned that right. For 9 months, Boyles worked at Gatesville, and during that time, he learned his lessons well. He became one of the worst bullies in the school. Luckily, the boy didn't die, but a judge sentenced Boyles to 4 years in the federal youth facility at Englewood, Colorado. Boyles was 16 when he arrived, and this is how the prison psychologist described him. "I do not see him as a psychopathic personality, but I fear that he has formed some sort of criminal identification." The psychologist recommended a treatment program for Boyles that included counseling and schooling, but Boyles would have none of it. The psychologist also added with surprise and irritation that Boyles had developed, for unclear reasons, a chip on his shoulder and had decided that no one can really be trusted. Boyles served 2 years at Englewood before he was paroled. Without friends, a job, or any skills, he washed dishes in a cheap hotel for 2 months before he stole a car and headed to Oregon on a vacation. Arrested and taken to jail, Boyles feigned illness and then overpowered the jailer when he came to investigate. Captured a few hours later, he was taken to a different jail where he repeated his ploy, this time beating up the jailer and escaping again. Within days, he was arrested and sentenced to 8 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. This man verbalizes considerable bitterness and resentment concerning his parents and their faults of infidelity, incompatibility, and his father's inebriety. For 6 months, Boyles remained in the state prison. He wasted no time getting into trouble again. As soon as he was paroled in the summer of 1965, he teamed up with a pal from the prison who was also on parole, and together they went on a multi-state crime spree. By the time they were caught a week later, Boyles and his partner had robbed a bank, kidnapped the California State Comptroller General, his wife, their small child, stolen several cars, held 6 other people as hostages, and murdered an Oregon police officer. Boyles wrote a short confession when he was taken to jail. Because he had dropped out of school at age 11, the note was filled with grammatical and spelling errors. Amazingly, a copy of it was still in his prison file more than 20 years later. I felt people just really didn't give a damn. Well, if they don't, I don't. So to hell with it all. I'll just do as I please, but I know that is not right. I know I'll go back to the joint, this time for good. Besides, what difference does it make anyway? Who cares? This time, the prison psychologist who examined Boyles reported that there was little chance he could be reformed. Treatment as such may not ever have any effect on this young man who has been a social problem for years and who now must be classified as a major social problem. The only known solution is long-term confinement. This is a drastic technique, but it is the only known way to preserve community safety. Because he had been found guilty of the federal crimes of bank robbery and kidnapping, Boyles was initially sent to the prison at McNeil Island near Tacoma, Washington, but he was later transferred to the Oregon State Penitentiary to begin serving a life term for murdering the policeman. Incredibly, on May 17, 1974, 9 years after his crime spree, Boyles was issued a 4-hour social pass to visit a girlfriend in a local motel. While the social worker sat in the parking lot waiting, Boyles slipped out a bathroom window in the rear of the building. In fact, that a convicted cop killer had been issued a social pass made front-page headlines and sparked community outrage. Police organized a massive manhunt, and after several days, 2 FBI agents thought they spotted him walking down the street in Eugene, Oregon. But because he was not wearing a beard, they weren't certain. One of them approached Boyles on foot while the other stayed behind in his car. He asked me for identification, Boyles recalled, so I reached around like I was getting my billfold, but instead I pulled out my gun and started shooting. The agent reached for his gun too, but he had made a hole in the lining of his jacket, and when he pulled the weapon from his holster, it got caught and fell harmlessly to the sidewalk. The agent jumped for cover. I fired every shot, and you know what? I missed him. It still cracks me up today when I see these guys in movies shooting at each other with one shot across the football field. Hell, we were standing 5 feet from each other and I missed him. Boyles grabbed the agent's gun and ran. A few blocks away from the shooting, he broke into a home owned by Earl C. and Viola Hunter, an elderly couple whom he took hostage. Forcing them into their car, Boyles managed to elude some 100 police officers who had flooded the neighborhood. Once he was safely out of Eugene, he pulled into a field and ordered the hunters outside. I told him I was going to kill them, Boyles remembered without a glint of emotion. But it wasn't anything personal, you know. I wanted them to know that I didn't have no hard feelings against them, and I had hoped they didn't have no hard feelings towards me. Hell, I didn't even know them. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and so I killed them. Boyles shot Viola, age 61, first. I told her to make her peace with God, and then I shot her in the head. Earl, age 63, was next. He went to pieces, so I shot him in the head, and then shot both of them in the heart to make certain they were dead. 2 days later, Boyles was captured after a wild chase that ended when he was shot in the stomach while trying to ford a river. He was sentenced to 2 additional life sentences for the Hunter murders. This time, no prison psychologist bothered to evaluate Boyles, but an anonymous prison official did make this notation in his file. This man is ruthless, has no conscience, shows no sign of regret or remorse. He should never be released again in society. In prison, Boyles had proved to be as uncontrollable as he was on the streets. Over the years, he had violated just about every prison rule. At one point, he was arrested by guards for placing an advertisement in the National Enquirer, posing as a psychic with 72 years of experience. For $3, he offered to tell the future. He also was caught trying to hide a homemade listening device in the room used by the guards so he could overhear when they planned to search his cell. His record included reprimands for possessing drugs, strong-arming, sexual misconduct, gambling, carrying a knife, but Boyles was best known at the Hot House for successfully bribing a guard in 1981. The incident began innocently enough when a guard stopped outside his cell one afternoon and complimented him on a painting that he was doing. The money would be delivered to the guard by a friend of Boyles outside the prison. Inmates were not permitted to have any cash at that time, and the guard knew he could be fired if he got caught. But when he hesitated, Boyles reminded him that he was already guilty of accepting a bribe, the painting. The guard was soon working as Boyles' mule, smuggling in money, marijuana, and pills. Other guards became suspicious when they noticed the two men spending so much time together. When the guard reported to work one morning, he was frisked. He was carrying several .22 caliber bullets in his pocket, destined for Boyles. Carl Boyles doesn't give a damn about anything or anybody but himself, said Eric George, the veteran cell house manager who had agreed to let Little move in with Boyles. He's a real cold-blooded piece of work.